The year is 1809, the small English town of Leominster. A woman named Jenny Pipes stands before the magistrates. Her crime? Speaking ill of her husband, being what they called a common scold. Her punishment is something that had been done to women for centuries, the ducking stool.
They strap her into a wooden chair with iron restraints. They parade her through the streets of her own town. They wheel her to Kenwater Bridge, where a crowd has gathered. And then, in front of everyone she knows, they plunge her into the freezing water. Again, and again, and again.
But here's what the magistrates didn't expect. Jenny doesn't break. She doesn't beg for mercy. Every time they pull her up from the water, gasping and shivering, she hurls insults at the men who condemned her. She curses them. She screams at them.
And this moment becomes the last recorded ducking of a woman in England.
Think about that date for a second. 1809. Napoleon is reshaping Europe. The Industrial Revolution is transforming society. And in England, women are still being thrown into rivers for talking too much. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you what medieval Europe did to women accused of adultery or simply of being disobedient. And I warn you, some of what you're about to hear will disturb you deeply, because the people who designed these punishments weren't sadistic monsters. They were respected community leaders, priests, lawmakers, and they genuinely believed they were doing God's work. Before we dive into the specific punishments, you need to understand something crucial. This wasn't chaos. This was a system. A carefully designed machine of terror that operated across centuries and continents. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was never truly hers. The moment she married, she became what legal scholars called femme couverte, a covered woman, covered by her husband's identity, his property. And like any property, damage to her was a crime against the owner, not against her.
An adulteress wasn't just breaking a marriage vow. She was committing theft. She was counterfeiting heirs. She was destroying a man's most valuable asset, his certainty about his bloodline.
Think about the economics for a moment. No DNA tests, no birth certificates. The only way a man could be sure his children were actually his was through absolute control of his wife's sexuality. Her infidelity didn't just wound his pride, it threatened to redirect his entire fortune to another man's bloodline. It could destroy alliances between families. It could invalidate treaties between kingdoms.
So the response had to be proportional to the threat. And that's where it gets dark.
The punishment that was considered merciful. They called it the carting or the penance walk. But those gentle names hide something far more sinister.
Upon the dawn, the bailiff and his men broke into your home. They did not arrest you quietly. They made sure your children watch as they dragged you to the town square. A barber approaches. Sometimes the same man who shaved your husband for years, but he's not here to give you a haircut.
Historical records from Augsburg describe how they would deliberately make the shaving as ugly as possible. They'd leave patches, cut the scalp until it bled, make the woman look not just shaved, but diseased, monstrous.
One account from 1487 describes a woman who begged them to at least make it even. The crowd laughed. Her humiliation was their entertainment. But the shaving served a deeper purpose. In medieval symbolism, a woman's hair was her crown, her beauty, her feminine identity. Joan of Arc was accused of heresy partly for cutting her hair. For a married woman, her bound or covered hair was a symbol of her modesty and marital status.
To shave it was to unmake her as a woman, to strip away not just her hair, but her social identity.
Then came the stripping. In some regions, they'd leave her in a thin shift, basically a nightgown. In others, particularly in England and parts of France, the law explicitly required complete nudity. Why? Because female nudity in public wasn't just shameful, it was spiritually contaminating. She became a walking curse, something that polluted the air around her. Now here's where the psychological torture really begins. She wasn't just paraded through any streets. She was marched past her own house, past the church where she was married, past the market where she bought food, past the homes of people she'd known since childhood. And here's the truly diabolical part. Participation wasn't optional. Town records from multiple cities show that citizens could be fined for refusing to witness these processions. Your neighbors, your friends, people you'd shared meals with, they were legally compelled to be there. Many went further than mere witnessing. Court documents described crowds throwing not just rotten vegetables, but stones, mud mixed with human waste, dead animals. A record from 1342 describes a woman who lost an eye when someone threw a sharp bone. Another account mentions a pregnant woman who miscarried from the trauma.
The authorities didn't intervene. This was working as intended.
And then came the final cruelty, the return home. She'd be released at her own doorstep, where she'd often find that her husband had already locked her out. Her children had been told not to speak to her. Sometimes her possessions would be piled in the street, already claimed by neighbors. But the punishment didn't end there. A woman who underwent this ritual was marked for life. She couldn't remarry, couldn't get work, couldn't worship in church without sitting in a special section reserved for public penitents. One chronicle from Paris describes a woman who, 15 years after her penance walk, was still recognized on the street and spat upon.
This was social death by design, and it was considered the lenient option.
When an accusation lacked proof, or when the authorities wanted to make God himself the judge, they had something far worse: trial by ordeal.
To medieval Europeans, this wasn't barbarism, this was the ultimate form of justice. They genuinely believed that God would intervene to save the innocent and condemn the guilty.
Which makes what actually happened even more horrifying.
The most common ordeal for accused adulteresses was trial by cold water, and the theology behind it reveals a twisted genius. The water used wasn't just any water. It was blessed by a priest, sometimes taken directly from the baptismal font. The reasoning went like this. Since water was used in baptism to wash away sin and welcome people into God's grace, it would naturally reject a sinner. Pure water would not accept impure flesh. Here's how it worked, based on detailed records from dozens of trials across England, France, and Germany. The woman would be brought to a river, pond, or specially constructed pool at dawn. The entire village was required to attend. A priest would perform an elaborate ceremony, blessing the water, calling upon God to reveal his judgment. The woman would be stripped to her shift. Then, and this is explicitly documented in legal codes like the Sachsenspiegel, she would be bound in a specific way. They'd tie her right thumb to her left big toe, her left thumb to her right big toe, curling her body into a position that made swimming impossible. Some regions added a rope around her waist, but here's the crucial detail. The rope wasn't for rescue, it was to retrieve the body afterward. She'd be thrown into the water, and the crowd would watch.
A horrifying physics. A human body's buoyancy depends on many factors: lung capacity, body fat, water temperature. A terrified woman taking rapid, shallow breaths might initially float.
And if she floated, guilty, rejected by God's holy water, she'd be pulled out and immediately executed. But if she sank, innocent, accepted by the water.
Of course, a bound woman sinking in water can't swim, can't breathe. Historical records show incredible variation in how long officials would wait before pulling someone out. Some accounts suggest minutes. Others say they'd recite a full prayer first, potentially 5 minutes or more. Here's a specific case from 1194 in England. A woman named Edith was accused by her husband's brother. She was subjected to trial by water. The Chronicle says she sank like a stone and was pulled out nearly drowned. She was declared innocent.
She was also brain damaged from oxygen deprivation. She died 3 days later. The record notes that her husband was ordered to take her body for Christian burial, as she had been proven innocent by God's judgment.
Think about the psychological torture of this. You're accused of a crime you may or may not have committed. Your fate is being decided by whether you float or sink. Either outcome could kill you. And you're supposed to believe that God is watching, judging, and will save you if you're innocent.
In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council finally banned trial by ordeal. But not because it was cruel. The Church decided that making God perform miracles on command was theologically inappropriate. It was disrespectful to God. The suffering of the women wasn't the concern. The propriety of the ritual was.
The punishments we've discussed so far could still result in death by accident or misfortune. The next punishment was designed to ensure something worse, that you'd survive, but wish you hadn't.
The laws of King Cnut, which governed England in the early 11th century, stated clearly: a woman who commits adultery shall have her nose and ears cut off.
Not may,
Shall. Let me walk you through what this actually meant. The woman would be brought to a public square, tied to a post, or held down by multiple men. A blacksmith or barber would perform the cutting. They had the sharpest blades and steadiest hands.
No anesthetic, no alcohol to dull the pain. In fact, some regions explicitly forbade giving the woman anything to bite on, because her screams were part of the spectacle.
The nose would be cut off first. Not just the tip, the entire nose, cut back to the bone of the face. The amount of blood was tremendous. Women would choke on their own blood, which is why they'd often be held face down.
The ears would be cut off next. Then the wounds would be cauterized with hot iron to stop the bleeding. The smell of burning flesh would fill the square. The woman's screams would echo off the buildings.
And the crowd would watch, forced to witness what awaited any woman who strayed. In 1231, in a German town, a woman named Gertrude was accused by her husband of adultery with a traveling merchant. She denied it. He had no proof except his suspicion and the testimony of one neighbor who claimed to have seen them speaking alone. Under local law, this was enough for conviction. Gertrude's nose and ears were cut off. The Chronicle mentions, almost as an aside, that she had 3 children under the age of 7 who watched the mutilation. It notes that her youngest daughter couldn't cease crying for many days after. Gertrude survived the immediate trauma, but here's what happened next. Her husband divorced her, which was automatically granted in cases of proven adultery. She had no way to support herself. Her face made her unemployable. She couldn't beg effectively because her appearance scared people. Within 6 months, the same Chronicle reports that she was found dead in a ditch outside town. The assumption was starvation.
No one was prosecuted. Her death was not legally anyone's responsibility.
But the purpose of these mutilations went beyond punishing one woman. Every mutilated woman became a walking warning, a piece of living propaganda that said, "This is what happens." And because the mutilation was so distinctive, a missing nose and ears, everyone who saw these women knew exactly what their crime had been. There was no hiding it, no starting over in a new town. The punishment followed them everywhere, until death. For common women, mutilation. But for noble women, for women whose families had power and influence, the medieval legal system had devised something arguably worse. A punishment that would destroy you slowly, in darkness and silence, over years or even decades. 1314. Paris. The Tour de Nesle Affair. Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy were married to the future kings of France. They were caught, or at least accused, of having affairs with 2 Norman knights, the Donnet brothers. The evidence? Embroidered purses. Their sister-in-law Isabella, Queen of England, had given these purses as gifts to Margaret and Blanche. Later, she noticed the knights wearing them. She informed her father, King Philip IV. The men were arrested and tortured until they confessed. Their execution was among the most brutal in French history. They were publicly castrated, their genitals thrown to dogs before their eyes. They were flayed alive, broken on the wheel, then finally beheaded. But for Margaret and Blanche, death would have been mercy. Instead, they were sentenced to life imprisonment in Chateau Gaillard. Their heads were shaved publicly before the entire court. Then they were locked away. Based on architectural records, Margaret's cell was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. Stone walls, one narrow window too high to reach and too narrow for a body to pass through. The door was sealed with an iron lock. A small opening at the bottom allowed for food to be passed through once a day. She was allowed no visitors, no letters, no news from the outside world. The only human contact she had was with the silent guard who pushed a tray of food through the opening. No books, women of her status usually couldn't read anyway, but none were provided. No candles beyond what was needed to see her food, no materials to write with, nothing to mark the passage of time, except the rhythm of food delivery and the change of light from that single window. Margaret died in her cell after 2 years. She was around 25 years old. The Chronicle says she died of natural causes. Modern historians suspect either murder to clear the way for her husband to remarry, or simply the physical toll of isolation, malnutrition, and untreated illness. She had been Queen of France. She died in a stone box, alone. Blanche lasted longer, 8 years of enclosure before being moved to a convent where she spent the rest of her life in continued isolation. By the time she died, she'd spent more time in captivity than she'd spent in freedom as an adult.
Now, let's talk about the men.
Because while women were being drowned, mutilated, and buried alive for adultery, what was happening to the men they allegedly committed adultery with?
The answer will make your blood boil.
In most cases, a fine. Sometimes banishment for a period. In rare cases, public penance, like wearing a sign or making a donation to the church.
That's it.
The double standard wasn't subtle. It was explicitly written into law. The Sachsen-Spiegel, one of the most influential medieval law codes, states that both men and women can be punished for adultery. But here's the catch. A man's adultery only counted if he was sleeping with another man's wife. If he was unmarried, or if the woman was unmarried, it wasn't legally adultery for him. It was just fornication, a minor sin requiring confession.
But for women, any sexual contact outside marriage was adultery. Full stop. The crime wasn't about the act itself. It was about the property violation. And here's the most glaring part. The men who participated in the punishment process, the judges, the executioners, the priests who blessed the water for the drowning, the crowds who threw stones. Statistically, many of these men had committed adultery themselves.
Research into court records shows numerous cases where men who sat in judgment on adulteresses were themselves later revealed to have kept mistresses, visited prostitutes, or fathered illegitimate children.
The hypocrisy was the system, the cruelty was the point, and the message was clear. Women's bodies were not their own. Women's sexuality was a resource to be controlled, regulated, and punished when it strayed from male ownership. If this video disturbed you, good. That's the point.
Because understanding how societies have controlled, punished, and destroyed women throughout history isn't just about the past.
The slut-shaming, the victim-blaming, the different standards for men's and women's sexuality.
These punishments weren't isolated incidents of medieval cruelty. They were systematic, legalized, performed with the full support of religious and secular authorities across Europe for centuries.
And perhaps what's most disturbing is how recent this history actually is. Jenny Pipes was ducked in 1809. The offense of being a common scold remained on the books in England and Wales until 1967. In New Jersey, it wasn't struck down until 1972.
The tools have changed. The iron bridles and ducking stools are in museums now, but the impulse to control women's voices, women's bodies, women's choices, that hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. Drop a comment telling me which part of this history shocked you most. And if you want more deep dives into the darkest corners of history, subscribe now, because there are more uncomfortable truths we need to uncover.